Welcome to Breaking the Narrative, a Stand With Us Canada podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Primorano, and in each episode, we'll dive into the fight against anti-Semitism and the delegitimization of Israel. From student leaders to community advocates, we'll explore how people are standing up and making a difference. New episodes drop every other Thursday, so let's get into this week's conversation. Welcome back to Breaking the Narrative. I'm your host, Jesse Primorano, and we're thrilled to be back after a short hiatus. Thrilled as well to be joined by our guest today, Colin May. Colin is a Calgary-based lawyer, academic, and author who's written on the topics of cancel culture, countering anti-Semitism, professional regulations, and many more. And it's that background that brings him here today. Colin has also served on a number of boards and tribunals at the federal and provincial level, including for a time in 2022 serving as the chair of Alberta's Human Rights Commission. Colin, we're thrilled to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me, Jesse. Great to be here.
Colin, just for context, Colin and I met last week in Calgary at our Natasha Hausdorff event, and I was able to learn a bit of your background, Colin, which is, really why I thought right away as soon as we spoke that I wanted to have you on the podcast. I wanted to, not just, share your story a little bit more within our circles and our network, but also, with the incredible background you have academically, researching some of these critical topics that we cover, that we, support our students on. I really feel like this conversation is going to be, really interesting to those that are invested in these issues. So again, thank you for joining us. Would love to start with talking about your time on the as the chair of the Alberta Human Rights Commission. I might be butchering that, but why don't you tell us a little bit about what your background, what brought you to that role. We could talk a little bit more about what took place afterwards, but let's just hear a bit about your background.
Sure. So, just kind of I grew up in rural southern Alberta. I went off I studied political philosophy and especially the history of the idea of right or rights in the philosophic tradition from, Hobbes and Locke through Rousseau and Kant and people like that. I eventually went to Harvard. I studied there. I did mostly medieval Islamic, Jewish, and Christian political philosophy. I eventually went on to work at the UN and the Red Cross in Geneva, Switzerland, and dealt with international humanitarian law and fundraising at the Red Cross. I went to Paris then, studied for another degree in political philosophy. Came back to Canada, did my law degree, became a lawyer. 2019, I was appointed as a part-time commissioner of the Alberta Human Rights Commission. So in that capacity, I wrote around 40 published decisions, and then also I did quite a few mediations. And I had also, my family had a very negative experience with my sister's professional regulator when my father passed away. She was an RN. When my father died, there had been some problems with the palliation, and specifically some wrong dosing of morphine. The individual who did it blamed my sister because they thought it would be easier to blame a member of the family who was, of course, not on duty at the time as a palliative RN. But she was investigated by her regulator wrongfully, and she was exonerated. But I became quite involved in trying to reform professional regulation here in Canada. And of course, because the process is a complaints-driven process with a professional regulator as well, that's very similar to human rights, again, a complaint-driven tribunal. So the UCP government of Premier Jason Kenney appointed me in 2019 as a commissioner, though I should point out that I also had quite a good relationship with the Alberta NDP and Rachel Notley. My partner worked for Rachel Notley for 4 years, and so I knew them quite well. Many of them have been in my home. And when the position of chief came open in 2022 at the Human Rights Commission, I applied, and in May 2022, I was given the job.
So it sounds like you have, a whole slew of personal, professional, and academic, experiences that have sort of brought you to this point today, brought you to the point of being appointed chief in 2022. And I know you mentioned the NDP. I guess to segue sort of into that next chapter of your life, you were removed from that position not a long time later, stemming from a book review that you did in 2009. I'd love for you to share, I guess, that story. I don't want to tell too much of it. I want to hear it from your own words, but tell us a bit about what happened, how that book review came back to light, and sort of what your position was, as the story unfolded.
Sure. So, yes, I had written a book review. I've written a number of academic book reviews and articles, and that was just one of them. Of course, as I said, I had studied medieval Islam, especially the Mutazilite tradition, and when I was at Harvard. So I wrote this book, or book review. The book was written by Efraim Karsh, who's a very famous Jewish-British historian of the contemporary Middle East, and was published by Yale University Press, so a very reputable academic press. I reviewed it in 2009. It was published. At that time, nobody paid any attention to it because it's a fairly esoteric type of book review. It was mostly about approaches to studying Islam, or to studying in the Middle East, Muslim majority countries in general, and their politics. So it wasn't particularly widely read. But when I was appointed as chief of the commission in 2022, a left-leaning blogger here who was involved with the Broadbent Institute, and so connected to the NDP, though not necessarily a member, I'm not sure. But he decided that he found this book review, and we suspect it was provided to him by the Alberta NDP. That's what I was told by an NDP MLA, but we're not sure yet. So this was presented. This blogger then gave it to the National Council of Canadian Muslims. They went to the Premier's office, to Jason Kenney's office, and said they didn't like it. And I was asked, the Premier's office reviewed it. Apparently, their initial response was that it was not Islamophobic, it was not racist in any way, it wasn't offensive. But despite that, I was made to meet with representatives of the NCCM, which I did twice. They wanted an apology. I wouldn't give an apology. I made a statement, but not an apology, because I figured, well, this is a legitimate book review. I can't apologize for doing legitimate research. So what eventually happened, though, was there was a bit of a piling on effect. A few more people came out against me. A couple of academics who had no specialization in human rights decided I wasn't qualified to be in the job, though they didn't know my background. And as time went on, I was in the job until September 15th. And eventually the National Council of Canadian Muslims decided that they would put out a public letter, and it went to the media, it went to the minister, stating that they wanted me removed because I had threatened to sue my critics, which was only a few of the bloggers, and that I had failed to prioritize meeting with the Muslim community, though I met with a number of representatives of the Muslim community, many outside of the ambit of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and they didn't know that. They didn't bother to find out. But eventually the Kenney government capitulated and fired me.
I mean, this is the most cookie cutter case of cancel culture I think we can identify. I mean, that I've seen in a long time. Right, talking about something that was, like you said, an academic piece of research, and more importantly than that, even in its review, like you said, was determined to not be Islamophobic, to not be racist. In the rectification of certain people's perception of your writing, you met with affected parties, and sort of like we see in many cases, that apology, which effectively, like you said, would diminish the the accuracy or the validity of your research, and even as you as a researcher in that way, your unwillingness to do that to yourself was, I guess, like we say, not enough for them. For the mob, not for the any particular community, but for that cancel culture mob. And so I can understand, why you've been so driven to focus on cancel culture as a result, because it really becomes inexplicable to us, like to the everyday person, to understand how people can do things that are based in fact, and then have their lives sort of turned upside down. I mean, you worked for years, like you said, your university, all your academic studies, your professional pursuits, and you reached this position that, I'm sure had great value to you personally, and to have it taken away from you, I just want to talk about, how sorry and apologetic I am to hear, that story and to hear what you've gone through. But how has it, helped develop your understanding of this new era of, ideological scrutiny and cancel culture? Where does your focus lie today as it relates to that part of things?
Well, certainly I figured, what is the best response to having been canceled for writing is probably to keep writing. You can't give up, you got to fight back. So I've done that. Of course, I have a couple of lawsuits ongoing, but I focused a lot on cancel culture. And in part, I think that connects also to one of my other main interests academically, which was especially about what had happened in the 20th century, how, you can read Solzhenitsyn, who will talk about the lie that the Soviet regime used. You look at fascist regimes and how they distorted truth and cancel people who they don't like. So I already had an interest in it. And another book review I had written was about a collection of works by Solzhenitsyn. So that's always also in my head. So I've looked at cancel culture specifically. I came to it and I thought, well, what is going on here? And at Harvard, I had certainly seen a lot of political correctness, which was prominent in the late 80s and early 90s, but it kind of died a death because it was often challenged in courts. Especially universities would put in place these speech regimes and they would be challenged in court, and the American courts generally just shut them down. But what I decided to do was then, okay, well, let's look at what cancel culture is all about. And there have been certainly some books written about it, quite a few now. A lot of them do case studies, and they will provide something of a definition, which is usually sort of a functional definition that lists about 6 elements of what happens. And ensures you that cancellation is going on. But what I tried to do then was get really into the motivations behind the parties, the psychology, looking at the class element. Most cancellations occur within the professional managerial class. And I looked at the legal responses, which include things like defamation lawsuits, wrongful dismissal lawsuits. And I've just kind of kept going from there and looking at as many of the actual aspects of cancellation to really get down to what happens, why people do this, what it connects to, and ultimately also to the theories that have driven the identity politics that, popularly called Wokeism, that often employs cancel culture and cancellation events as part of its armory.
It's fascinating. I think you talk about wokeism, and I think that word has sort of I don't want to say it's taken on almost too light of a meaning, in the sense of that we look at cancel culture and wokeism and we think in many cases, it's just this the next generation, young people who are less concerned about facts and more concerned about their feelings, and we sort of attribute that we say that it's more emotionally driven than anything else. But it sounds like what you're saying is that this is actually part of a much deeper issue, where these people are almost being weaponized to create this type of environment and climate where people are being canceled, where certain voices are being removed from the conversation. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. I think two things I'll say. First, there's always been people who tend to be on the left, but people on the far right can cancel people too. But the motivations behind it, I think, are important, because people have denied that cancel culture exists. It's just holding people to account. But as you say, one of the key things you find about cancel culture, and especially the motivations for cancelers, and I've looked at studies that have done research on this, it's not about the truth, it's not about objectivity, it's not about justice or helping those who are apparently the targets of the person deserving to be canceled. It's really just about virtue signaling to your own in-group. So you're very politically activated and motivated, and you virtue signal to that group. And of course, part of that is taking down somebody else. So that there's that motivation. But behind a lot of that, as you say, there's this movement away from objective facts, from reason as having being a conversation or communication between individuals or groups. And instead, it's about my feelings, about my identity, about this sense of being harmed. Also, the very binary approach of oppressor versus oppressed that we hear so much about, or the settler colonialism. And that, of course, to me, goes back to many of the important thinkers since I would go back to Martin Heidegger, to Nietzsche, and a lot of people talk about Marx or cultural Marxism. I tend to think Heidegger is more important in this conversation. But of course, there's been a number of thinkers who have sort of turned against the objectivity of reason, especially in the late 19th, 20th century, and they've kind of come to the fore in this group. Now, that's not to say they would be woke themselves. Many of them would not like it. But I think they've contributed to a sort of general atmosphere where facts and reason and discussion and dialogue are replaced by rhetoric and basically yelling. Who can yell the loudest, who can be the loudest and get the most attention, and also manipulate feelings and facts to gain a larger audience of support for their cause.
Right. Yeah. And manipulation, I mean, that's never a word that you expect to hear around something that is supposed to be noble, right? Like you talked about, like there's this idea that they are, virtuous in what they're doing. But in reality, another thing that I think is not talked about enough with this woke movement is, people act like it's a new thing, right? They say, oh, like now we've become, we have had this realization and, we're not woke, we're awake, whatever kind of nonsense you hear. But again, to your point, this is not something new. It's just something that we've seen many times throughout history, repackaged in maybe a different way. And to your point, I think that I would guess you're the academic here, and maybe you can tell me, but I would guess that when we see examples of this through history, they're usually followed by times that we're not proud to look back on, right? Fascism, all sorts of other brutal regimes, and I just think it's fascinating to see the connectivity between these experiences and how humanity may not be learning from its mistakes. Do you find that as well to be the case, that it's connected to more troubling times in our past than positive ones?
Oh, sure, yeah. I think, some various authors have written about this. And as I said, that includes Eric Kaufman, who's written about the Great Awakening, Musa El-Garbi, who's written a book about We Have Never Been Woke. And both of them actually point to instances in the past or times in the past when this movement has come forward. And Musa El-Garbi actually argues that as I said, it happens within the professional managerial class primarily, and it often happens when there's too many professionals and they all need jobs, so they start to fight with each other to gain prominence. So it's also driven just by that. But I think you're right. It tends to happen when there are pressures, social pressures, that push us towards these extreme ideologies and the promise of some sort of revolutionary change that will fix everything. And of course it doesn't. It produces death, it produces oppression, it produces cancellation, as I say, it produces a sort of very authoritarian system. And these are the times when we have, in the past, allowed these to happen. And usually they happen under some sort of rubric of supporting justice, allegedly supporting some sort of justice. And especially when we pit various social actors against one another, as we tend to do with woke, as it's called. You look at the notion of the oppressor versus the oppressed. This is very much in that concept, and it leads to a very bad political result.
Well, I think everything you just touched on, it really covers and encompasses the position that the vocal minority in the mob has taken against Israel through this process. You talk about the idea of, virtue signaling, but not really doing anything to help those who you claim to be supporting, the Palestinians, rather than targeting their true oppressors, Hamas. We've just sort of looked, again, as we've seen many times through history, for a stereotype, a group that we can oh my gosh, there's a word that's completely escaping me right now. Colin, do you know the word I'm looking for? Scapegoats.
Scapegoating,
Yeah, just the complete scapegoating of a people in order to make you sort of feel like you're doing something, to save the world. And right now, that's what we're seeing in Israel. And before we jump into that, I do want to just take a step back and stay on this cancel culture conversation for a second without betting Israel into the dialogue. You went to Harvard. Graduated from Harvard. You were there. What years were you on campus?
93 to 95. So I was doing my master's degree there.
So I'm just wondering two things. First of all, in just a short question, is there anything that you could have seen coming then? I mean, I know we're talking about 30 years ago, but were there rumblings on campuses in America at that time that you can identify as like sort of something that could have been nipped in the bud to maybe help us prevent from getting here? And then the second part of the question is, what do those institutions, institutions like Harvard, institutions like human rights commissions and government, offices, what responsibility or role do they have in either advancing or countering this climate of cancel culture? And how have we seen that play out, in front of us?
Sure. I mean, yeah, absolutely. When I was at Harvard, I certainly saw it. I had just completed, before I went to Harvard, I completed my degree at the University of Alberta in political philosophy, and I wasn't seeing it there. I wasn't seeing it yet. So that was 88 to 92. I did that. Now I think, though, University of Alberta, all our Canadian institutions have certainly changed since I went to school there. But at Harvard, I immediately encountered a lot of the political correctness. Now, the difference with political correctness was it tended to stay primarily within the university. I mean, it had some social impact, but it was primarily on campus. And it took part of, again, these intellectual movements that, like postmodernism, post-structuralism, neo-feminism, critical theory, especially through Herbert Marcuse, who was, again, a student of Heidegger. So Heidegger, I am going to get around to writing about Heidegger and wokeism eventually too, but because I think he's sort of at the core of a lot of it.
Just add it to the list of things to write about.
yeah, it's on there. It's on the list. But certainly it was there. But it, as I said, it primarily manifested itself through speech codes that the universities tried to impose. Those were then challenged in the courts in the U.S. and they were struck down. So it kind of died. It didn't really have a lot of strength then. But of course it kept percolating at the universities and becoming more and more entrenched. And with some of the recent events that we saw, the killing of George Floyd, especially that was a main trigger in the U.S. In Canada, we had the residential school issue in the Graves. That became a main trigger here. So it sort of just came together. Everything came together at the right time. Though I would say it's probably started, the cancellation culture that we are dealing with started about 2012, became probably more ingrained and prominent by around 2016. By the time I was fired in 2022, it was still going quite strong, but it's certainly diminished since then. But as you say, and maybe this is a way of thinking about what's going on with these universities and with Israel, it's the whole October 7th issue has really brought it back to the fore, or at least it's brought the ideas that are animating groups like the pro-Palestinian encampments at universities really coming out into the open and fighting it out. Now, in terms of institutions, this is sort of an area where I'm moving into now to see what's the next phase of cancel culture. What I've found, reading various authors who talk about the players in cancellations, there's three of them. So there's the cancelers, who are generally social activists, social media activists especially, the target, who's the person who gets canceled, and then there's the third-party institutions. and they actually have to facilitate the cancellation, because usually cancellation involves deplatforming, disinviting, or being terminated from your job. And institutions have to allow that to happen. The cancelers don't have the power to do that. They can start the movement, but an institution actually has to ultimately facilitate the harm that the target suffers in the end. And that's what I think is a very important piece now, whether it's our universities, whether it's our governments, things like tribunals, government mandated tribunals. Those institutions now seem to be, and I think we're moving into a new area of cancellation. They're actually taking on the role, in some sense, of the canceller, and we don't need the canceller anymore so much. Those institutions are taking on that role, and we're seeing that through some of the issues around free speech, especially people who are being targeted for putting out a social media post. We certainly have Lucy Connolly in the UK, who's in jail for 31 months because of a post she put out. And that's just an interesting new dynamic, which is concerning to me, that we sort of institutionalize cancellation now. So it's not just social actors who are on the far left, virtue signaling, but we actually have it threatening within our institutions, especially government institutions that can incarcerate people or otherwise fine them through tribunal hearings. And that's sort of where I see it going. Also with Israel, there's a sort of cancellation going on there as well now. The motive of these people seems to be to cancel Israel in a way.
I mean, it's definitely they've tried, I guess, for decades and decades to see the destruction of the state of Israel, or we'll say the dismantling at the very least of the state of Israel. And I guess when that didn't work, now the next best thing to try is to just cancel it outright and see if a social cancellation works instead. The problem is that the institutions that enforce these international cancellations, don't really have the credibility or the merit to go ahead and do anything. And it's nice to see that some of the global powers around the world have, really come out and stood in strong solidarity with Israel through all of this to give it the legitimacy it needs, to continue. It's interesting what you talk about. I mean, I imagine it almost like a domino effect where the cancelers knock the institutions, and then the final domino, of course, is the target, as you called them. But it's kind of nerve-wracking and concerning to hear that the institutions are becoming the first domino. Do you think, is that just a result, when you talk about where it was before, where the cancelers would put pressure on the institutions, were the institutions then just effectively, kowtowing to the public pressure and caving in and canceling these people just to not have to deal with this mob? And now, are they just trying to get ahead of the game and be almost even more virtuous by just canceling before the mob even comes breaking down their door? Or, are they just concerned about, the property damage? I mean, this question could go on forever. I guess the way I'll summarize it is to say, how did we get here? What are these institutions afraid of? And how do we get them back pointed in the right direction, and helping to allow free speech to exist the way it should?
Well, I think there's a couple of things I could talk about, but what I'll focus on primarily is that these institutions have, as you say, they've sort of taken on this role themselves, and I think their motivations are, in part, it is the ideology that they have brought on. And we can go back to what we were talking about earlier, that even in the past, you see this happen. There'll be social movements that then gain power or capture the institutions. And I think that's largely what we're seeing, is certain social movements have now been able to capture politicians. Why they do it? I think some of it is because they have concerns about changing demographics in their countries, and they want to just get votes. Getting votes is a concern always for politicians in the West. Also, as you say, there was a movement from, of course, trying, as in terms of Israel, certainly from its birth in 1948, Its neighbors tried to wipe it out more than once. They failed, and they seemed to realize that that wasn't going to be a success. And even in that context, we would see movements like Hamas or Hezbollah. Certainly they're associated with the Iranian regime, but they tend to be somewhat more similar to social players who then become political players. And of course, they have often captured the international institutions that are supposed to be neutral arbiters but aren't anymore. So I think we're seeing this movement into the institution because the social players have now been able to gain power. They have people in the right positions, they gain power through that. And so we see things like Online Harms Act that's proposed, especially to monitor social media. And I think that's where we're seeing the institutions sort of just absorbing this. And as I said, in the past, that's been typically what happens. Social groups like the Communist Party in Russia, the Nazis in Germany, were more of a social movement originally, even you might even say a sort of secularized religious movement that eventually takes power. So it's not an uncommon transition to go from a cancel culture that's active primarily in the social sphere and motivated by social actors and activists to now see it moving into the institutions. So we don't need that social activism at the beginning anymore. The cancellation will simply be triggered by the institutions themselves. So they'll control the whole process. And that often the way the target will react to that is exactly the same way the target reacts to a cancellation event, by attempting to apologize, make a statement, and mollify the cancelers. And again, I would point out in Lucy Connolly's case in the UK, she pled guilty to the allegations against her, the criminal allegations. Now, there's certainly a legal reason for doing that, but behind that legal reason, there is a very similar dynamic that a target plays out every time the mob comes for them.
I think it's so fascinating to listen to you describe all of this and the way that it's played out, because we're seeing that everywhere we look. Like it's not a matter of it's not hard to see, I guess, that many of our parties on the left side of the political spectrum have sort of been infiltrated with this type of rhetoric, and have sort of been infiltrated with that cancel culture, and again, especially as it relates to Israel, the inability to discern facts from the feelings projected onto them by the very vocal minority that we keep talking about. And like you said earlier in the conversation, it's really a manipulation, essentially, where people are being forced to decide, do I stand up to this crowd and do I deal with being told that I am a bad person, a bigot, Islamophobic, whatever it might be, or do I stand up for the truth? And unfortunately, we're seeing the truth being shifted like right before our eyes every day, because people are, like you said, being called out for things that are egregious to call somebody out for, but then apologizing because they're too afraid of losing whatever it might be, their position in the administration of the university or in government. And so speaking of these institutions and universities, I would love to get your take on DEI and where we're at right now with DEI as it relates to, silencing certain voices and elevating others. The Jewish community has really suffered at the hands of DEI, and, I'll just go on record and say DEI is a wonderful concept, but in many cases, wonderful concepts can be perverted by bad actors, so just curious to get your take on that as well.
Well, DEI certainly is an offshoot of this. It's related. It's related to cancel culture. In a certain respect, you could see it as the institutionally approved version of cancel culture. And I think
that was sort of how I made that connection there. As you were talking, I said, you're describing the evolution of DEI. Mm-hmm. Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's fine. Like with DEI, certainly there, as you say, there are certain motivations behind it that are laudable. And the first thing I would say is, as there is a push to get rid of DEI, we have to be somewhat careful, because there certainly are programs that are put in place or now come under the DEI rubric about helping more marginalized communities, gain access to higher education, that sort of thing. And I don't think we want to eliminate those. Well, maybe some people do, but it's really this sort of aggressive notion that there is an ingrained effort to ensure that certain peoples, certain groups, identities are not allowed into higher education or the social sphere, and that it is based on sort of this notion of white privilege and that, as I said, the oppressor-oppressed model, that we now have to accept anybody who claims to be oppressed and their feelings and their narratives and their discourses, rather than looking for truth. So I think DEI is highly problematic in its current form. Certainly some institutions, here in Alberta, the University of Alberta got rid of its DEI office and changed the name. Well, changing the name doesn't really change the substance. And I think institutions that think that that's sufficient to do that are deluding themselves, because people are not that foolish. They know what's going on. But I think certainly the DEI approach has galvanized these ideological notions that are prevalent at the university and are, as I said, they've moved out of the university. But they originate, of course, in certain areas in the university, sometimes called the grievance studies or the area studies. And they've certainly taken over a lot of the social sciences, the humanities, law schools, and they're prevalent also in medical schools. And they've also, another key thing they've done at the universities is they've produced this massive bureaucracy that has ballooned administration to the detriment of the faculty and the students. They've just produced a lot of jobs for people who are already in that professional managerial class, as Musa El-Garbi has talked about in his book. It doesn't really do anything for these marginalized groups. It just helps to promote the careers of people from those groups who are already in an upper middle class. So, of course, Musa uses much more of a class-based analysis to critique DEI. But I think that's what we're looking at. Is it's a fairly negative thing, and I would hope we move away from it.
And that's the most, again, that's the most frustrating part, the last piece that you touched on, that in the end, it's not actually doing very much to help the people that it claims to help. It's only, as they say, quote unquote, the rich get richer sort of thing, that there's people who aren't the targets of this intention, of this, desire to help, that are being elevated, that are finding salaries they wouldn't have otherwise had. And again, the same way as we talk about the Palestinian people and Hamas versus Israel as their oppressor, it feels to me like so much of this woke mob really has no concept of what they're doing and the way their impact is being felt, and if they are actually helping anyone, or if in reality it's themselves who need to be helped, right? That there's some sort of inner wounds maybe that need healing, that as long as they can feel that they're doing something to help someone, that they're helping themselves in some way too. And it's really difficult and frustrating. I know I'm just on a bit of a rant now, so I'll try to curtail it here and come back to a question I wanted to ask you, to sort of change the narrative a little bit, the conversation, I should say. Free speech is super critical. Obviously, that's why we're having this conversation. At the same time, as Jewish voices are being silenced and pro-Israel voices are being silenced on university campuses, in professional workspaces, government, and beyond, there are other voices who have been platformed substantially in a way that has demonized not only Israel, but the Jewish people as well. It's brought slogans and sayings like glorify and globalize the Intifada to Canada, to America, to the West. And in many cases, our community, the Jewish and pro-Israel community, while calling for the ability to have free speech, for our students to not be marginalized and sidelined, we are simultaneously calling for other voices to be limited and in some cases censored. And so that does lead to a bit of sometimes criticism from people who are unwilling or unable to evaluate a situation with any kind of nuance or critical thought. So I would love to get you as an expert to help talk to our audience and give them the tools they need to help and educate others about basically where the line is between free speech and hate speech, right? Where it's not limiting somebody's free speech to tell them, that calling for the death of every Jew in the Middle East is, something that doesn't belong on our streets in Canada. So I would love to just hear a bit about how you draw that line and how you communicate to others where we can as well.
Well, I'm maybe in a bit of an odd spot here. I probably don't approach these things in a sort of binary way either. I'm not a free speech absolutist. Although, as I say to many people, I've never really thought of myself as a Zionist either. But then, to me, Zionism was, a movement built by Herzl and Jabotinsky and people like that, responding to the assimilationism of Hermann Cohen, who was, of course, a very famous Kantian Jewish philosopher. So I've always sort of put it in that academic background. But I think when we're talking about hate speech and free speech, of course, has been given a constitutional importance, especially in liberal Western democracies. Of course, for the Americans, they take it to, some people might say, an extreme, but they have a lot of protections for speech, and you can pretty much say anything you want in the U.S. as long as you don't just incite violence, which pretty much means you have to get people organized and running around chasing people, to actually do them harm. The UK is not quite so far. Canada doesn't go quite that far, but hate speech is not constitutional in the same way. Here in Canada, we'll look at Section 15 of the Charter and say, equality rights, so that will often be where we'll talk about these things. But hate speech is a sort of negative thing, right? Where free speech is positive. This is something we want. And of course, it has a history. It developed in large part in response to religious situation. The Christian church had a significant control in the West. Much of our Western history since the 1500s has been curtailing the political power of the church, and one of the tools for that is free speech. So I think we have to remember that free speech is one of our fundamental values in liberal democracies. Hate speech is something of an exception. So you really have to get to the point, I think, where it's a clear incitement of violence. And of course, a lot of people, and I tend to agree, the more speech you have out there, the more discussion, the better. Of course, just yelling at people isn't going to, being in the streets yelling, calling to globalize the Intifada and, wipe out Israel is not exactly particularly constructive speech. But I think, we have to remember free speech, I think, is the fundamental value that we want to protect. And certainly also along with that, academic freedom, which is somewhat different. Of course, it tends to occur primarily in the university. Plus, it also implies a lot of standards that go along with academic research, like peer review and citations, that sort of thing. But we have to be aware that there are these voices out there that do incite violence. And I think that's where we have to say, look, we got to do something about that. This is not an approach we want to take, and that's a political decision. Ultimately, we have to say politically, where do we draw the line? We have to, I think, look at the free speech going as far as we can, but when you are really calling to wipe out an entire group of people, and especially given that group of people has faced this quite regularly in the past, I think that becomes a concern, and we have to start saying, where do we as a nation want to go with that? Are we willing to accept this sort of hatred? And what happened to me, I would say, is a version of hatred too. Using terms like Islamophobia or racism, which are becoming so hollowed out now and meaningless to so many people. Just using them to silence other people, that's it's a political decision we're making. We're allowing that to happen, and I think our politicians have to respond to that. And going forward, because so much of cancel culture and this hatred, and because cancel culture is very much built around a sort of hatred of other people. You don't want them to talk. You don't want to hear them. You want to silence them. Because it's moving into our institutions and is being given some statutory support, I think the response to that has to be the formation of more and more civil society organizations that stand up to these things, but also that protect people who are targets. In my case, the Lawfare Project out of New York is funding much of my defamation lawsuit. And I think we need more of that. We need more of these civil society organizations who will step up and defend people who are attacked. And that means providing money. It means providing money for lawsuits. It means providing money because when you're attacked, you're deplatformed, you lose your living, you lose your job, you're terminated, as I was, and you've lost your livelihood, which is a significant thing. Apart from being put in jail, the next most damaging thing that can happen to somebody is to lose their livelihood and their reputation, which makes it very difficult to get back into the workforce. So I think we need these civil society organizations that stand up to this across the board, and they need to have funding, and they need to be able to stand up and say, we will protect this person who's been canceled. Because for many people, and I've talked to many people who have been canceled, it's just a completely devastating thing to go through, because you lose, many become suicidal. Some do commit suicide. It's not uncommon. So I think we need to really have these civil society organizations that stand up to this hatred, which is cancel culture.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing that you're saying, because effectively, earlier you talked about how it's these social groups and organizations that are putting the pressure in the first place on these institutions to follow through with these cancellations, right? And now it's the cure, the prescription for that is to have the community on the other side stand up, speak up, and really put their resources where their mouths are, and say, like, I'm not going to sit on my couch and listen to this podcast and talk about, what a terrible tragedy. I can't believe Colin went through that. But, to actually look into it, to learn, to see where you can find a way to support, an organization like the Lawfare Project, for example, like you said, that's doing important work like this. It's really interesting, and I think important for us as a democracy, for voices on both sides of the table to be heard. I think a big part of the problem is, like you experienced, where if you're on one side of the table and you on the side that you found yourself, and you disagree with these folks who aren't actually interested in the facts more so than their feelings, then all of a sudden you're being told what a horrific person you are. You're a bigot, a racist, whatever it might be, and so that intimidates a lot of people. It's a challenge to come out and speak up against that, when even though you're right, what's coming for you. I think that's really challenging. So there are definitely parallels. Just to go back to something else you said, there are strong parallels between your story and what Jewish and pro-Israel voices are experiencing right now. Folks who are speaking up for Israel in Hollywood, in government, in academia, are experiencing a similar. Shai Davidai is probably the most notable example over at Columbia University, right? Who's been treated extremely poorly by the Columbia community since he decided to become a strong advocate for Israel. So I guess acknowledging that parallel, I'm curious. You've had a lot of experience studying these movements. You've written about countering anti-Semitism. You've experienced it yourself through a different lens. Can we talk a bit about those anti-Israel movements on campus and how they've risen to such prominence, and what's taken place, I guess, that's allowed them to become the leading voices and the arbiters of truth, on their campus?
Well, again, it goes back to some of these ideologies that are prominent amongst the certain elements in the faculty, and the administration has certainly taken them on. As I said, what we are seeing in the universities is the administration has been more captured by these movements than the faculty. There certainly are members of the faculty who are not in favor of this, but they self-censor. There's been a lot of research done to show that many academics self-censor now, which is, of course, the other side of the coin. There's the attack that can happen that silences people, but as people see that, they self-censor. They're afraid to speak out because they know that what will happen to them is what happened to these people. Their careers will be destroyed. Their lives will be destroyed. So this has become a tool on campuses that these organizations have used to gain this power. And I mean, let's be honest, part of it is that there is significant funding coming from certain sources. There's been research, of course, done on this as well, about where funding is coming to support some of these groups. Certainly the Qatari government has provided a lot of funding to the pro-Palestinian groups. And we're seeing now, even in North America, much of the funding is actually coming from within the United States or Canada now. And their support, of course, many of the groups are not actually students at the university. Many of the members of these groups, they are outside agitators, if you will. So I think they've been allowed to sort of fester. This notion has come forward. There's the financing for it. And, I look at even here in Alberta, when there were encampments at the University of Calgary and the University of Alberta, and here in Alberta, they moved very quickly to remove them. And I wrote about that a few times. And I wrote about law professors here in Alberta at the University of Alberta, University of Calgary Law Schools, who put out a letter condemning the removal of these encampments as, a constitutional violation. I then wrote a piece pointing out to those same professors that they weren't very good at being at law because they didn't do the full analysis, which should have said that no, it is constitutional in Canada to remove these encampments. Which, of course, when a case came forward by the University of Toronto, just a few weeks after I wrote that piece, the judge said, yeah, he basically followed my reasoning. In a lot of ways, I don't think he read my piece, but, it's not that hard. It's actually a fairly easy area of law to understand about trespass and the constitutional rights involved. The judge didn't really have a significant struggle with it, and he justified removing the encampment at the University of Toronto. So, when you've got academics like this, law professors who should have known better, who just were misleading the public, because there's no way they couldn't have known the law. These are law professors. So we've got that going on, that we've turned from the university as a source of study, research, information, of looking for the truth, to this new activist mode of discourse and relativized truth that has become so prominent amongst these academics. And then the politicians too, NDP politicians here in Alberta made a big fuss about those encampments being removed. Well, they were the same politicians who attacked me. Efraim Karsh, who attacked me quite a bit publicly. Kathleen Ganley, who was a former justice minister, who I know was wanting to attack me more. And that's just a bit of one of the things that happened when I came under attack originally, amongst many, was that other members of the New Democratic Party came to my defense, not so much publicly, but certainly contacted us and did make complaints to their own party about what they were doing to us. So there was a pushback in the party that actually slowed it down a bit, but still, some of them were very hostile. And I think this is the problem. We've got politicians, and the NDP, let's be honest, in Canada is one of the worst parties for this. I mean, they have engaged in a sort of demonizing of Israel, just absolute acceptance of anything, in support of Palestine, or let's be honest, Hamas in many ways. And when we have that situation, it's pretty hard when you've got those elements in your society supporting these things.
I think that's the most terrifying part of the whole thing, is that it's not just about silencing voices that disagree with their opinion. It's silencing those voices so that they can make space for those who are supporting, openly supporting, a terror group. And the behavior that we've seen in Canada over the last 18 months, specifically in cities like Montreal, but really everywhere, speaks volumes to what happens when you allow this type of rhetoric to become the leading message in your country. And right now in Canada, pro-Israel voices have no room. The media is not picking up pro-Israel stories. They're not reporting they're parroting information that they get from the Gaza Health Ministry back to Canadians. And again, like, our politicians are silencing voices based in fact, like you and what you've been talking about, your whole story, in an attempt to basically change the narrative. That, if we can't affect a change in dialogue with our own words, then we'll have to do it by kicking and screaming until people are too tired of hearing from us anymore, and then they just do what we say. I maybe not the most eloquent way of saying it, but that's how I feel right now. And so, I guess just to ask you, where do we go from here? You've spent so much time studying, researching this. Where do we go? And maybe also specifically through the lens of the Jewish and pro-Israel community, how do we make sure that our voices are heard, and your people like yours are as well?
Well, I think there was the March for Israel in Toronto that had a number of, what was it, more than 50,000 people that came out. I think, those are the sorts of things that probably need to be done. But of course, unfortunately, there weren't a lot of politicians who showed up to support that. But, I think part of what just has to happen is the West has absorbed many of these ideas. We see governments supporting them, whereas we see what's going on in the Middle East now. And the facts on the ground in the Middle East are unknown to most of us in the West, or we don't care. We're more interested in how this will play in our own countries. Governments will be interested in how it will play in their own countries. Certainly, I think you look at France, UK, Canada, calling for ceasefires and de-escalations all the time, that would simply allow groups like Hamas and would have allowed Hezbollah and the Iranian regime to continue on doing what it's doing over and over and over again. We probably need the voices. Actually, this is an odd thing maybe to say, but we need the actual voices of people in the Middle East to be heard. Because you can go to the United Arab Emirates and they're going to say to the West, why are you doing this? Why are you allowing Hamas and their offshoots? Why are you allowing these Islamist organizations to even exist in your country? They don't allow them. You've got countries, Muslim countries in the Middle East that want to work with Israel. They're more they like Israel, but here we've silenced those voices too. We've silenced the voices of the people in the Middle East who are saying, look, this isn't going to help anybody. So I think we need to try, and the nice thing about Israel being there is that it does have this impact in the Middle East of, it's a successful nation. It's wealthy in many ways. It's very well known in the tech world. Has some very good relations with a country like India. You see, and a lot of Arab countries look at that and they say, well, we'd rather be friendly with them than a bunch of, the Iranian regime. So I think we need to remember those voices that are from the Middle East and actually pay attention to the people in the Middle East and what they're saying. But also, here in Canada, we have to keep working. There's got to be a continuation of breaking down what is the narrative, as you say, breaking there, of these voices that simply want to turn this into a partisan battle. We've got to keep talking out. We've got to keep acting. We've got to keep putting pressure on institutions. We've got to be getting, as you say, we can't just watch podcasts. We have to do something. We have to get up there. And for me, my contribution, I feel, has been doing this research. on cancel culture. As I said, I actually just a few weeks ago signed a book deal. So
congratulations.
I'm working on a book. A lot of it's going to collect some of my older essays, some of the things I've already written on cancel culture. But there'll be new stuff in there as well. I will be talking a bit about, I'm going to go back to, maybe this is a dangerous thing, I'm going to go back to the very book that got me in trouble, Efraim Karsh's book on Islamic Imperialism. I'm going to reassess it. Professor Karsh himself provided me with a statement about his work. So I'm going to go back and do that and try to say, look, this is objectively what is going on here. This is what I was talking about. And cut through the nastiness and the yelling and the vitriol. And we need more of that, I think. We need people who are going to use their skills to stand up to this. And I think now, one of the things that is interesting about cancel culture, as I said, because it's a fairly widespread social phenomenon now, whereas political correctness was fairly limited. Cancel culture has caused a lot of people to start thinking about how it works, what it is, and I think we just need more of that. So maybe the good thing about cancel culture, at least, is it's so pervasive now that we have people really thinking about where it's going. And one of the other things I'm thinking about down the road is perhaps to write something about, canceling Israel or canceling the Middle East, specifically to talk about how the dynamics of cancel culture in the West have actually silenced the voices of the Middle East. Edward Said, of course, sort of coined the idea of Orientalism as a way of the West imposing its views on the Middle East. And I think a lot of what we're seeing with these pro-Palestinian campus protests and that sort of thing is really a kind of Orientalism. We're looking at the Middle East and what's going on there through our own ideological lens, anti-democratic ideological lens. And I think we have to give some voice back to the people from the Middle East.
I think that's if we could empower and give agency to those voices in the Middle East, things I think would be a lot different here on the ground in North America. I truly believe, as we talk to a lot of these, anti-Israel voices, and our students are engaging with them every day, I just think they're confused. I believe in many cases that they're confused, In some cases, it's anti-Semitism. In some cases, it's having digested dis or misinformation. But in many cases, there's like a true lack of understanding about the dynamics at play in the Middle East. And I think one of the best examples of that are all of these folks who went, into Egypt last week, trying to get in from Egypt to Gaza to go in to provide aid, whatever it might be. There's two things that blew my mind about that. The first is like this notion that their little, whether it's Greta Thunberg's little boat or, these people, what they brought with them, is any semblance of aid that will actually be helpful to the Palestinians versus what Israel has been bringing and letting in over the, days and weeks before, to the exponent of hundreds more tons of aid. And then the second thing that really just blew my mind was that this we're gonna go to Egypt will let us through this border. It's this complete lack of understanding of any kind of nuance to the situation at all. It's like a fantasy in their head that they're gonna fly there and walk across the border and be welcomed with open arms by Hamas. It speaks to everything you're saying, that there's really just sort of a lack of listening to what the people in the Middle East are saying and what they need. And so we have to wrap up, in a couple of minutes, but I want to just end, I have two questions for you, one longer than the other, but I just finished talking about how everyone is extremely, misguided and lacking sort of the proper understanding of what they need to talk about this issue. A lot of folks, when they look at this anti-Israel rhetoric on campus, they say, "Oh, it's anti-Semitism. People are anti-Semitic," and that's true. But I'm curious, from your learnings as a researcher, what is driving this movement against the Jewish people on campuses in Canada, and why are other human rights violators around the world, specifically like Iran, who right now is being defended by all of these college students, the worst regime on the planet is all of a sudden being defended by North Americans. What drives this anti-Israel rhetoric more than any other human rights? No, sorry, to be clear, any of the real human rights violators around the world?
Well, again, there's probably a lot to that. It is our biases, our focus. It's what matters to us here in the West. And let's be honest, we don't get that concerned about what happens in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has had ongoing hostilities for years with many people dying. We don't get that worked up about what happens in Nigeria or in Sudan. But when I worked at the Red Cross, certainly there, for instance, there was an anti-Israel bias, I would say, generally. And we had a lot of sites where we were active, a lot of countries where the Red Cross was active. I would have to write reports on them for the European Commission Humanitarian Office, which is where I worked in that division to get funding from them. And it was an ingrained sense that Israel is the problem. And as you say, there could be massive human rights violations going on in the rest of the world, but Israel became the focus. And I think we've developed these discourses around anti-colonialism and settler colonialism, and of course Israel's an easy target. And I believe that a lot of these groups were hoping or desiring to actually wipe Israel out, because of course if you absorb the settler colonialism ideology, look, you're not going to wipe the United States out. I mean, people will still say that the U.S. has stolen land. They'll say that about Canada, whatever. But these countries aren't going to be wiped out. There's just too many people here. But Israel could. I think a lot of these people feel that they could wipe Israel out. So Israel becomes this target. And of course, this goes back, though. This I think also has to go back to the notion of anti-Semitism. Because one of the things that's happened historically through centuries for the Jews is that whatever is sort of the dominant moral ideology of the time, the Jews are always viewed as somehow in breach of that moral ideology. So, when you have Middle Ages, well, the Jews killed Christ. That was their great sin, the blood libel, all those sorts of things. When you get to the point of sort of the Enlightenment, Judaism is viewed as backwards and problematic from the perspective of reason. It's this old religion, tribal religion. Then when you get to more romantic age, where we're celebrating nations and ethnicity, then of course the Jews they're blamed for being too rationalist. They're considered the universalists and the globalists with all the money. Whatever the dominant moral view is, and in many ways now it is sort of the human rights or humanitarian view, the Jews are uniquely seen as the ones in breach of that moral code. And it happens repeatedly through history. Whatever the dominant moral code is, the Jews are blamed for being opposed to it. Nobody else is. So I think there is that long history of how anti-Semitism keeps morphing with the times, and the Jews become the target again. And it's sort of an odd thing that as much as it's happened in the past, that we're not paying attention to it again. We can't recognize it when it keeps happening. And maybe part of that is because, and this is something a lot of Muslims will complain about, is they'll say, well, the Holocaust happened in Europe. The Europeans were much worse to the Jews than we have ever been. I mean, and certainly, that denies part of the historical interaction between Jews and Muslims as well, especially more recently, where so many Jews have been driven out of Muslim countries. But now it seems to be that the Muslim world has taken on some of these traits that tended to be more European. Again, a kind of Orientalism that's been adapted in the Muslim world, which wasn't as traditionally concerned about Judaism. There's theological reasons about that and everything, though we often talk about Judeo-Christian civilization. Christianity can have something of a more hostile relationship to Judaism simply because it tends to see itself as fulfilling it, and Jews don't agree with that. But I think that notion, that historical ongoing notion, the Jews are somehow always on the wrong side. They're always against what we've decided on, whether it's the West or the Muslim world, of what is the dominant moral narrative. And that always plays against the Jews. I mean, they're always, as you say, there's the scapegoating mechanism, and it doesn't go away. And we don't seem to learn that. We seem to keep repeating it. And I guess that's unfortunately where the Jews have been fated to be. And I think, at some point we have to say enough. We have to stop this. And we can't say that. We can't talk about it if we're being canceled. I mean, one of the key things that I had talked about in my book review was Islam has a fairly imperialist sense of itself. Christianity does in a certain respect too, but Christianity has the separation between the church and state, especially in the Western Christianity. Islam doesn't have that. It tends to merge the two realms of religion and politics quite a bit through the caliphate. But if you can't talk about that, if you can't say that that's the history of Islam and is a dominant political element in it, well, you're not going to understand the Middle East. You're not going to understand the imperial ambitions of the Iranians or now the Turks. You're not going to understand the strong connection between Islam and territory, which in many ways impacts the Palestinians. You need to be able to talk about it.
And again, that comes back to sort of the beginning of our conversation, which is, there's an unwillingness to learn, to actually go into the nuance and the history and all the dynamics that you just described, versus just taking on what is the easiest way to sort of make you feel like you're signaling, like you're virtue signaling, like you're doing something to help, because it is complicated, it is nuanced, and I think it's really interesting to hear you sort of talk about how, despite all the research, everything that's been done, it still comes down to the same thing that we know to be true, that the oldest form of hatred in the world is anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism finds a way to morph to fit the current times that we find ourselves in, and that right now is Zionism, right? That the state of Israel represents the easiest way to attack the Jewish people without directly saying it. Last week I was scheduled to give a presentation to a large international corporation on Zoom to employees from around the world. And the presentation that I was asked to give was to talk about and identify, modern anti-Semitism, how anti-Semitism has morphed and reshaped to present itself today in 2025. And they said to me, please just don't touch on the war between the Hamas-Israel war. Don't talk about, death, anything to do with either side. If you're going to talk about Israel, just do it in the context of the Jewish connection to the land, whatever. No politics at all. Fine. I had a picture of an Israeli flag in my presentation, and I talked about the indigeneity of the Jewish people to the land, and they told me that it was too controversial, and they canceled my presentation half an hour before it was supposed to start. Right? Same idea. They're asking me to present on a topic about how anti-Semitism has morphed, and then they displayed that same anti-Semitism that was, well, we can't allow any slightly positive narratives about Israel to make their way into our office space because the people who are anti-Israel will freak out and cause a scene and it will become a problem for us. And so they're trying to deal with it before it gets there and just eliminate us instead. So all this to say, Colin, that this has been, I think, our longest episode of the podcast to date, and I feel like we're now just scratching the surface of a whole new conversation, which is, the ways anti-Semitism presents itself, to talk again about this notion of, the way all oppression around the world has been linked to Palestinian oppression, and now somehow every social movement that we see has become pro-Palestinian, and what that means for us as Jews in those spaces. And how we sort of take those spaces back. So I really appreciated your notion that the one thing we really need to do is, continue to educate, continue to lobby, and to speak up for ourselves, but also, like you said earlier, to help ensure that there are social organizations that are speaking up for those who can't speak in other spaces and that make room for them. And I'm curious, the last question, if in 30 seconds, if you can try to, you talked before about many people that are self-censoring in order to prevent cancellation. You're someone who's been through it all. You've researched it all. In short, what advice do you have for those who feel like they have to self-censor, for students who feel excluded by DEI structures and that they are, they're their position as a minority is being diminished by their institution. What's a short last piece of advice? Because I like to end with some hope. So what's a little piece of advice you can give to them?
Well, I would say, traditionally there have always been people who censored themselves some way, especially because through most human history there has been censorship. So people learn how to deal with that. There's a whole notion of how to sort of say things without saying exactly what you're saying. It's tough. But I think in this context, we can't self-censor. We have to be out there talking about what is going on, and we have to make these links. We have to undermine cancel culture. We have to push back against it. We have to form the organizations that will fight. And we have to fund them. They have to be funded in order to help people who are under attack. And as I say, that's why I'm so grateful to the Lawfare Project that they've come forward to help me. And if we don't do that, we will, you'll be undermined. The narrative will become the dominant narrative. The narrative that is suppressing voices will be the dominant and eventually the only narrative. And we have to make clear that that's not what we're going to accept. And whether that's, organizing on campus or social civil society groups, that I think has to be the counterfactual narrative, in a sense. It has to present the other sides, the other facts. And unfortunately, that's where we are now. But it's got to be done. And it does work. It can work. We have pushed back against these things in the past. Now, we haven't sort of rooted them out because they survived in much in intellectual circles and academic circles, and they have moved out into society. But we have to be able to push back against them and stand up to them and create another narrative.
Create another narrative, but also restore the accurate narratives that have guided us, through history, the principles of life. And, I think if there's anything, like we started off at the beginning of this episode by saying, I hope that people can take away from this that inspiration to speak up, the way that you have continued to through everything you've dealt with. I think that's the thing that inspires me the most, is the way you've continued to write, continued to speak up. And I'm glad that many of, our listeners will hear your story. I encourage everyone to stay in touch with Colin and with his work. And take his call seriously. Take the call to speak up, to rally and to organize and to bring social groups together. Heed that call and follow that lead, because together we can have the pendulum swing back to a point of equilibrium, to a place where truth can still reign and be our guiding light. And where we can, more importantly, find a way to have conversations with each other and to find ways to disagree respectfully and to use that disagreement to build progress and to build change. And so, Colin, I thank you for doing that. I thank all of our students who are doing that every day on campus across the country, Stand With Us Canada, Emerson Fellows, and Leventhal interns. And I thank you all for listening. We'll be back in the next couple of weeks for another episode with another fantastic guest, so stay tuned. Colin, thank you for being with us, and we'll talk to you soon. Mm-hmm.